This podcast does not provide medical nor legal advice. Please listen to the complete disclosure at the end of the recording.
Hello, possums, and welcome to Everyone Dies, the podcast where we talk about serious illness, dying, death, and bereavement. I'm Marianne Matza, a nurse practitioner, and I use my experience from working as a nurse for 45 years to help answer your questions about what happens at the end of life.
And I'm Charlie Navarrete, an actor in New York City, and here to offer an every-person viewpoint to our podcast. We are both here because we believe that the more you know, the better prepared you are to make difficult decisions.
So please relax, get yourself something to eat and drink, put your feet up, loosen your belt, and thank you for spending the next hour with Charlie and me as we continue our series about inclusive care for people with serious illness, those who are dying, and those experiencing grief. Today, we have part 2 of healthcare considerations for the LGBTQ plus community. In the first half, Charlie has a history lesson from the GLBT Historical Society, which was founded in 1985 as a primary resource for preserving public LGBTQ history. Based in San Francisco, the society collects and exhibits historical materials related to queer communities around the country, hosting events and educational opportunities for the public to engage in the rich and complex stories of the LGBTQ people. In the second and third half, I have an exclusive interview with Ezra Salter, who is a funeral director in suburban New Orleans and who was actively involved in the writing of the Louisiana LGBTQ plus end-of-life guide. So, Charlie, how are you?
I'm fine. I can't complain. I still do, but there's really, what's the point? What about you? What's going on?
Good. I've been working on embroidery, and I turned on the show. I don't know. You know me. I don't know what channel it was on, but it was Sean Hayes, and congratulations to him on his Tony.
Oh, yeah, the Tony win, yes.
Yeah, and Will Arnett and Justin Bateman. And apparently, not that I knew this, they have a podcast called, I keep wanting to call it Clueless, but that's not the name of it. Or Feckless. Smartless. And,
okay.
And they took it on the road and had like full auditoriums of people to talk to. And their format is, it's the three of them. I mean, it's literally no prep. And one of them takes turns inviting somebody to the show, and the other two don't know who it is. And they talk to them. And these three guys are just naturally funny. And from binging the entire series of it, it looks like they're even funnier when they're high. But that's just a conjecture that I'm making in terms of watching them. But these three guys are like in a suite in whatever city they're in, living together, eating a lot. I mean, they talk about food like more than I do. And I talk about food a lot. And you just, you kind of see the tensions between them. And it just was like good listening. Because when I'm embroidery, I look at what I'm doing and not, the
not it. Yeah.
But it was good. You should check it out.
Oh, I will. Thanks. I've heard of it, but I've never listened to it. So you said, one of them invites someone. You mean like out of the audience, some celebrity or some expert on something? Or
it can be, and they don't invite anybody out of the audience, but any of those other things.
Okay.
And I guess on the podcast, they try to get lots of different people. And so Justin Bateman, when they were doing the Boston show, invited some MIT guy who just didn't go over. Now, probably on the radio, on a podcast, he would have gone over just fine. But in a large auditorium, it just was like, you could just, and they kept panning the audience and people getting up and leaving in droves. It was painful. And then finally, this guy's talking like all this, nerdy stuff. And finally, Sean Hayes says, "So how do you imagine a robot would sound? And they start imitating robots. And this guy from MIT is like, what?
Oh, that's good.
Yeah. So it was good. I mean, I enjoyed it. But they've got like zillions of listeners, and
Oh, yeah,
then they
it's
take
huge.
it on the road,
Yes,
and they fill up auditoriums. It's like, I'm jealous.
yeah. Note the pause. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So anyway,
I don't
they
know.
should have us on. They should have
yes,
us on.
I think
bet you
so.
they don't have. I bet you they don't have anybody who talks about death.
No, they probably don't. Those bastards. The what?
Get that done, Charlie. Get us.
Sure.
an invite.
Sean
Get
Hayes
us
is
an
still in
invite.
town. In his show. I'm sure.
Yes, he's happy. He just won an award. Come on.
I'm sure Mr. Hayes won't mind if I show up and knock on his dressing room door before security takes me and throws me out the second floor window. Okay. So
But he seems like such a nice little guy.
yes, he does. Yeah.
So, speaking of food,
Yeah.
in order to get your next funeral lunch started, you could make a colorful rainbow sprinkle cake.
Oh.
Now, this is a white sour cream cake
Uh-huh.
that the layers have this fluffy flurry of funfetti inside. You say that fast 5 times.
Did you say funfetti?
Funfetti?
Funfetti. Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah, and you don't have to use fancy sprinkles for the inside of the cake. You could use ice cream sprinkles. In New England, we call them jimmies.
Mm.
In the ice cream topping, you can use jimmies, which you can find in the ice cream topping section of your grocery store. They won't melt with moisture, but under the oven's heat, they melt just right to leave sort of this colorful speckles throughout the cake layers. It's a very festive addition to the funeral repast, so consider that.
I will consider it. I have something a little more to consider. Marianne, I a couple of days ago I was talking with a bunch of friends, and we just started talking about World War II, and I mentioned the horror of the Nazis killing 12 million people, and one person said, "Well, yeah, but it was 6 million Jews," and I said, Jews got it the worst. But I pointed out, it was 12 million people. I mean, there were people, intellectual people who were against the Third Reich, people with mental deficiencies, and, of course, a tremendous number of homosexuals. So our first half story is about the loss of the first queer archives, adapted from an article by Gerard Koskovich and the GLBT Historical Society. 90 years ago this month, the Nazis staged their first book burning in Berlin. The gathering on May 10, 1933, saw hundreds of supporters of the regime marching into a square in front of the 18th century building housing the city's first public library, and across the street from one of Germany's leading universities. The crowd threw cartloads of books onto a huge bonfire, the flames lighting the night sky as propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels gave a speech attacking Jewish and, quote, un-German authors. You may already know about this grim event, where it's often portrayed as an example of the danger to freedom of expression posed by totalitarian dictators. But a crucial aspect of the story has disappeared in the retelling, even though it was highlighted by the book burners themselves and was covered in news reports at the time. A major portion of the works thrown to the flames had been seized a few days before on May 6th from Berlin's celebrated Institute for Sexual Science. Founded in 1919 by homosexual and transgender emancipation pioneer Dr. Magnus Hirschfeld, the Institute was home to the first museum, library, and archives anywhere in the world to give a prominent place to the history and culture of homosexual, transgender, and intersex people. During the Weimar Republic, Germany's democratic government from 1918 to 1933, the establishment drew wide media attention, gaining visibility as a provider of medical and psychosocial services and as a destination for researchers, curious locals, and international tourists. The growing influence of the Nazi Party made Germany a potentially dangerous place for Dr. Hirschfeld. Nazi propagandists used him as a prime example of what they called degenerate Jewish sexuality. Hirschfeld had always been extremely proud of being German. However, he realized that he would no longer be safe in Germany. Hirschfeld settled in Switzerland shortly before Hitler was appointed as Chancellor of Germany on January 30, 1933. Hirschfeld recorded his reaction to being forced into exile. "If Germany doesn't want me, I don't want it either." On May 6, 1933, a Nazi student group marched to the Institute for Sexual Science in Berlin. With members of the Stützpunktbewegung, or SA, which was a paramilitary organization associated with the Nazi Party, they ransacked the institute and looted its library and archives. Days later, the stolen books, artifacts, and clinical files were destroyed in one of several public book burnings organized across Germany. A bus of Hirschfeld was paraded through the streets on a stick before being thrown onto the bonfire. Within months, Nazi authorities forced the Institute for Sexual Science to close. Much of Hirschfeld's life work was lost. However, his publications and ideas continued to influence the study of sexuality and gender after his death. In recent decades, Hirschfeld has been increasingly recognized as an early pioneer of the movement for LGBTQ+ rights. To celebrate, please go to our webpage for the recipe for rainbow sprinkle cake and additional resources for this program. Your tax-deductible donations are always welcome so that we, well, especially Marianne, can continue to offer you quality programming on end-of-life issues and the path there. Thank you in advance for making your donation at www.everyonedies.org. That's every, the number one, dies.org. Marianne?
Thanks for that, Charlie. That was really interesting. The focus of our last two programs has been on end-of-life issues in the LGBTQ plus community and things you need to know to protect yourself and those you love so that your wishes are respected at the end of life. This week, we're pleased to have Ezra Salter with us, and they're going to talk with us about their work with writing the Louisiana LGBTQ plus end-of-life guide. Let's have a listen.
Hello, and welcome to our third half. We have the pleasure today of interviewing Ezra Salter, who is a funeral director in New Orleans and who was very instrumental in the development of the Louisiana LGBTQ plus end-of-life guide. Welcome, Ezra.
Hi, thank you so much for having me today.
Thanks for taking the time to chat with us. We're, starting our series about inclusive care, and I thought I'd start with the question of, what do you think are the greatest barriers to gender-inclusive death care?
So gender-inclusive specifically, I think there are some pretty big barriers. The first one being obviously education of the service providers. In my experience as a funeral professional, I find that even when the professionals you're working with are deeply compassionate people who do care about others and don't want to offend and don't harbor any negative opinions about gender diverse people, a lot of them still just are not informed about the realities of the trans experience or the gender diverse experience. A lot of them aren't informed on current language, and then also how to navigate situations where a deceased person's legal next of kin might not be, fully respecting of their identities. It's just one of those things that you're not trained on how to deal with that, and it is a very sticky situation as a professional if, you're expected to provide service to people, but you're also trying your hardest to respect the person who's passed, even if the people you're providing service to don't necessarily respect the people who've passed. So yeah, I think definitely the biggest barrier, first and foremost, would be professional education, but then also education of consumers. There's a lot of, laws and regulations and things that you can do to protect yourself as a gender diverse person before you pass, to try and have the quote unquote best death possible, or the best outcome, for the people that you love who might be, grieving your loss or handling your death care. There's a lot you can do and a lot to be prepared for, and getting that information out is difficult, and making sure people, are ready to also hear that information and ready to act on it. Because just because something doesn't mean that somebody's ready to talk about death or prepare for the end of their life. But yeah, getting that information out to the public and having people sit down and evaluate, well, what are your wishes? What are your biggest concerns? And what can you do to protect yourself to have those wishes honored?
So we're, our purpose for being at Everyone Dies is public education. And so what is it? I mean, are there specific things that you're like, these are the things that we really need to be working on or educating people? Do you have like a top 3 or 5 things that you'd want people to know?
So speaking specifically to the trans community, and then also the larger LGBTQ plus community, the biggest concern for a lot of people is going to be, will my wishes be honored, especially in a situation where the person that you want to facilitate your end of life care is not your legal next of kin. And what can you do to make sure that that person has all the rights and privileges they need to prevent bad actors from coming in and inserting their own opinions into the situation? And so here in Louisiana, we have an option where you can assign your primary right of disposition to a chosen representative. So you can prearrange your own funeral. You can settle your estate. You can, help coordinate your own hospice care if you're, have the faculties to do that. You can give your power of attorney to somebody before you are incapacitated. And those are all great, very important avenues. And those are all pretty accessible avenues. Lots of people do that. Lots of people know about it. That information is shared. But the next step of giving your right of disposition of your deceased body to somebody that you care about, somebody that you trust, was sort of the missing puzzle piece. And what that means is that, when you pass away, your power of attorney is no longer valid. In Louisiana, your prearrangements are not protected. So even if you prearrange and prepay for your funeral, your legal next of kin can come in and decide that they vehemently disagree with your opinions and your options for yourself, and are going to do whatever they want to do in regards to your disposition. And I've seen it happen, and it is wildly heartbreaking. There's just prearranging and prepaying does not protect you, because the funeral home cannot legally decline your next of kin. And so it's that extra step of sort of, locking the box and saying, like, no, I am firmly stating that the disposition of my physical body shall be handled by this authorized representative and nobody else. I specifically do not want this person who would be otherwise entitled to my disposition to do that. And it was sort of this key piece that was missing. And it was a law that was always out there. And occasionally we would see it with like guardianship services, where there might be an elder person who didn't have any family, or the family that they did have left were like in-laws, which are not, any technically next of kin, that they would bring in these documents, these legal documents stating, so-and-so will handle the disposition of Mr. Whoever. But as far as using it as a tool in the LGBTQ plus community, that wasn't really being explored. And, that's a situation that's really, or a tool that's really great for people who have estrangement. But we also see it a lot with couples, gay couples who did not get married. And you have somebody that's been your partner for 50 years. And, you've been together so long that by the time gay marriage was legal, it just didn't seem worthwhile. Or, there's lots of other reasons people don't get married, legal, financial reasons. And they think that when their partner dies, that they're going to be able to come in and handle their cremation. And they can't. And now they're stuck waiting. In Louisiana, you can wait 30 days. And after 30 days, if nobody comes forward, then you're allowed to handle disposition, any interested party. But if you're up against a family member who has that legal right, you're out of luck. And it also, just knowing that your loved one is sitting there and that you can't do anything about it and that the state is withholding that right from you for X amount of time is very painful. And there's things that you can do to prevent that.
And can't family also come in and, for trans people, say, I don't acknowledge that, my daughter is now, has transitioned to being a male. And so Susie is going to get, laid out in a dress, and her tombstone is going to say Susie, even though that's not who he has been.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And that's, another great reason to give your right of disposition to somebody else, somebody that you trust, that's going to validate your identity and, perform your disposition in a way that is respectful to you. Assigning your right of disposition is a great way to prevent people from having access to those ways in which to disrespect you into perpetuity, which is so sad. And some things that, you give your right of disposition to somebody, but you can put whatever you want on a headstone. There's no laws about a headstone. You can put whatever you want in an obituary. But to do your death certificate, if you've gone through and you've changed your name and you've changed your gender marker and you've done all of these legal proceedings, if your family comes in and they say, well, we don't like that, they can sit there and, tell the funeral director, everything that's posted publicly about this person is going to be a dead name. Even if, maybe you have all your ducks in a row and they can't put your, dead name on your death certificate, and they have to put your current legal name, which good for you if you've gotten all that figured out. They can still sit there and tell the funeral director to make all of these choices that are disrespectful. But if you give your right of disposition to somebody who's going to go in and sit with those professionals and say, no, even if they didn't get all their ducks in a row and did not legally change their name, everything that you post publicly outside of that death certificate is going to be as respectful as possible.
And so, in the funeral industry, do they assume that you don't know sexual orientation or gender identity of the deceased unless someone has explicitly said so? Do you go by what you see, or how does the industry itself know where that person is?
So sexual orientation is not necessarily our business. I and my colleagues are of the practice that if somebody has a partner that comes in and says we are legally married, we're going to honor that. I'm not asking anybody to produce a marriage certificate unless there is an obvious conflict. Straight, gay, regardless. I'm not asking any family to produce any sort of marriage license unless somebody else is coming in and saying this is a lie and it's going to be like a whole legal drama. But in regards to gender, when we take a call, typically either from a family member or from a nurse, we ask, what is the gender of the deceased? And they tell us, and that would be the time for them to tell us, whether or not this is a transgender individual, to say, if it's relevant at all, to give us that information.
When is it relevant, or is it really relevant in your industry?
I would say it is relevant in regards to the death certificate. because that's where things get a little bit complicated. And that would be why the hospital or the family would need to give us a heads up, just to make us aware of navigating that. A lot of trans people will not change their gender marker. Well, first of all, in Louisiana, it's very difficult to change your gender marker unless you've had a very invasive procedures of sexual reassignment. And so, that's not everybody wants that. Not everybody has access to that. Not everybody their body can physically handle that kind of surgery. There's lots of reasons why people don't have these very intense surgeries. And in Louisiana, they say if you don't have these, then you can't change your gender marker, which is super unfortunate. But the other reason is that a lot of times it complicates things with your health insurance. So, even if you've transitioned, you might still need a prostate exam. You might want to get a hysterectomy. And those are medical procedures and medical care that is very much based on your sexual assignment, your sex assignment. And so with insurance, there's not really a whole lot of knowledge, a whole lot of system, current system updates that are made to accommodate that. So sometimes if you change your gender marker with your health insurance, you no longer have access to those like sex-specific procedures.
That's a tough one.
Yeah, those gender-specific procedures that are, very relevant for people's health care. And so if you are somebody who maybe you've changed your gender marker on your driver's license and all these other documents, but on your health insurance, it's still the gender you were assigned at birth. Well, if you die in a hospital setting, that might be what's in your chart. That might be what the nurse tells the funeral home. Or, if the family makes the call and we put one gender marker and then the hospital has a different gender marker and the doctor goes to sign the death certificate, that's also going to be a little bit of a flag to say, hey, what's correct? This is what we have. This is what you have. And that's another, bit about being sort of prepared as you move through the end of life process, to have somebody who can advocate for you if you are passing in a medical setting, to make sure that the caregivers that are going to be working with you are respectful of your gender identity and understand the situation. And also that when you do pass, that they are going to sign your death certificate with the correct gender marker. If you've gone through the steps of changing it in other places, like your driver's license, changing it with the state, changing it with Social Security, then if you have these conversations, you can make sure that it's also going to be correct on your death certificate. Because what we've discovered with writing the guide is that ultimately that little letter is kind of up to the discretion of the doctor who's actually signing the death certificate, and they need to be on board. Yeah, it's interesting. It's a lot of just sort of making sure that the professionals around you are also respectful and having somebody who can advocate for you, and ask for a different professional if the first one reveals themselves to be disrespectful.
Right. So, it's an ongoing issue in, the United States in general, without respect to gender or sexual preferences, is the general population doesn't do advance directives and, has a general kind of death-denying attitude. And so, we're always struggling with education regarding that. But it seems to me that it's even more important in the LGBTQ plus population to have these things done in advance. But in my experience, I don't see it done in my patients, who have died and who are in these alternative situations. So how do you think is the best way to go about educating the LGBTQ plus population to say, do you have to tell horror stories in order to get people to kind of say, oh my God, I don't want that to happen to me. Let me get my paperwork done. Do you have thoughts about that?
Yeah, I mean, we are definitely struggling with that. We are struggling to say, how do we get this information out to the most amount of people possible? How do we get this information out to people who are at a place in their life where they're ready to sit down and do this? Because, I'm relatively young. I'm 31. Like, I'm not really, do I know people in their 30s who have pre-planned and started their end-of-life planning? Yes. But, I'm not really at that place in my life where I'm kind of putting those ducks in a row. So how do we get this information out to an older population who needs this information, who's starting to think about these things and make these plans and settle estates and do wills and things like that? And yeah, it's tough. We've partnered with local groups. We host events. But a lot of that stuff is getting out through social media. And maybe, a lot of these people don't use social media, older generations, or if stuff's not reaching their social circles. Certainly, if I have clients come in and experience any sort of, difficult situations in a legal sense, I will let them know, hey, there are these things that you can do to plan your end-of-life situation that would make this easier. I know that we weren't able to do that for you and your family, and now we're navigating this other situation. But if you have friends who are having similar experiences, please let them know that they can do this paperwork. They can, get these documents signed and nominate these representatives. And it'll make things a little bit easier for them. So I try and let my clients know too, because that is sort of, you are directly experiencing something that is, unpleasant and painful. But yeah, we're definitely stuck trying to answer that question. I mean, we do as much community outreach as we can, but it is hard to reach the social circles of older populations.
Well, Ezra, I'd like to kind of just throw in my 2 cents worth in terms of I would think, or what my experience tells me is that to say, well, at 31, you're not really thinking about that, but, older people should. Well, I would go and say, well, everyone should, because if you think about where these advance directive laws came from, the people that set these things in motion, Karen Ann Quinlan, and those people, those were young people, even younger than 31, who were in situations where, invasive kind of care was being given to them, and the family didn't think that that's what they wanted. And so, if you're younger, you can, get hit by a car, or, all kinds of things can go on. And if I think we perpetuate the myth that, well, this is really, something that we really need to focus on the older people, I'd say, well, no, I think that we, part of maybe Pride Month or other activities should be, here, let's have an event where people sign, these documents or get a packet of the documents or that kind of thing. What do you think of that?
Oh, I definitely agree with you. It's not that I don't think that it's relevant to younger people. I just know that younger people are less active or less proactive in getting things like that done. But I'll also say that I think that there is a financial barrier to entry in some of these things. At 31, I don't have a whole lot. So it's not really financially feasible, nor does it really make a whole lot of logistical sense for me to go see an estate attorney. And so what is my estate? I'm worried about maybe who would take my dog. And also I'm married, so that changes things too. Certainly if you're unmarried, it's different. I think a lot of that depends on your wealth and your assets as far as like estate planning, your physical stuff and your finances. With your end-of-life planning, you can assign your right of disposition to somebody, but that comes with the financial burden of your death. And so if you say, I'm going to nominate my best friend, and your best friend is bartender and doesn't, make a whole lot of money and can't afford to cremate you, if they can't raise the money through your friends, they might have to turn to your family and say, hey, I can't pay for this. I'm going to have to ask you to pay for it, in which case it's their money. They're going to do what they want. And, you know,
so can they do what they want if the paperwork for the right of disposition is filled out?
Yes. So the person who receives the right can decline it.
Ah.
Yeah. So they're not, you know, and that's the other thing. The form that the disposition of remains directive that we've written with the Pro Bono Law Project for Louisiana does not require the consent of the person receiving the right. And so they can decline it. They can say, you know, this is too much for me, or this is too expensive for me. I don't want the right of disposition for this person. And, you know, you always have the option to put in a second place person, which is a good idea, especially in case the person that you've given your right to passes before you.
Right.
But yeah, there might be situations where the people that you give your right of disposition to just physically cannot accommodate that. They can't handle that emotional and financial burden, and they may have to turn around to your legal next of kin and say, like, I can't accept this right because of whatever position I'm in. So that's something to be really aware of, is like giving your right of disposition comes with a financial burden. And unless you've prearranged your funeral, or you have some sort of trust, or you've also given that person your estate and access to your estate and your bank accounts and everything when you pass, they are going to have to pay for that themselves, or gather the community and community support to pay for it, which can be difficult. And so I think that's a lot
like
of
an
it.
advance directive where people can, you know, assign somebody, and then I've been in a situation as a nurse where I've called somebody and say, well, you're, you know, the decision maker. They gave their advance directive to you, and they're like, what? We never talked about this. I have no idea what she wants, you know. So the conversation in both those situations is really important, isn't it?
Oh, yeah, I agree. I feel like we should add a part for somebody's consent, but I will say it is not legally necessary. Legally, it doesn't require the consent of the person receiving the right. But yeah, I'm like, please tell people, please this is a conversation. This isn't just something you do at like one of our Sunday like legal clinics, and like you just forget to tell your bestie, or you just like assume that they know. Like, no, this is a conversation you need to have. You need to give these people copies of the paperwork. You need to arm them with not just your right of disposition. You also need to make sure that they have access to, you know, the funds necessary to perform your disposition, that they're aware that it's going to happen. You know, it's a definitely bigger conversation. But like my partner and I have advance directives. You know, that doesn't really cost anything. But if something were to happen to me and it was like a huge financial burden, you know, she may have to turn to my family or her family or something to get more support. And again, we're married, so that sort of clears up some issues. But if you're an unmarried person, I mean, there are some things you can do that are free. And assigning your right of disposition is a free service. You know, we have legal clinics. You can get the paperwork online. You could take it to a notary. We provide free notaries. But it comes with a financial burden. A lot of things come with the financial burden of either executing the thing that you've prepared for, or paying a professional to sit there and actually work this out with you, paying an attorney to make these plans, paying a funeral home to prearrange your funeral. That's expensive for a lot of people, especially younger people who are focusing their financial, you know, thoughts elsewhere, who are worried about, you know, paying rent and not being crushed under the iron fist of capitalism.
Yes, that's important. We have to watch that iron fist. Well,
yeah, definitely.
I think I really appreciate you taking the time to talk with me about and raise these issues, so that hopefully our listeners will stop and say, well, what's really important to me, and if my chosen gender identity is important and I want that, you know, I don't want to be buried in a dress, and and I don't want my dead name on my tombstone, then if that's a real important value, then you need to take the steps so that that value is honored, right? And if you say, well, nobody has the money, so let mom do what she wants, then that's like a whole other story.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know a lot of people in their 30s who just have $13,000 to pay for a full traditional funeral with like an open casket. I certainly don't have that kind of money, and I work in the funeral industry. I would get it at a 75% discount, and I still don't think I have that money just like offhand. And yeah, so I think
there's lots of other less expensive choices too that
there are, but if that's what you want, if you want a viewing, if you want people to be able to see your body, you have to consider what your options are, because that's not your only option for somebody to be able to pay their respects to your physical body. There are certainly less expensive options that don't involve just immediately being cremated. But also, if you want to be buried, that costs money. The property costs money. I certainly don't know anybody under the age of 40 who has burial property. And I'll tell you right now, in New Orleans, the cheapest burial plot is $750. And that is in a city-run cemetery with, it's rather unfortunately called a servitude. So you don't own the property. You're just paying for the right to be buried on that land. And they can move you or disinter you as they deem necessary.
Oh, really? Wow.
Yeah, which the city tries its best to act ethically in that situation. And in New Orleans, we have a culture of disinterment. And usually when that's happening, it's that somebody, another family member is being buried in the same place, because I am very good friends with the superintendent of city cemeteries, and they try their best to bury families together at their request. And so sometimes that requires moving people around. But all that to say, you don't own that plot. That's not your plot. That is the city's plot. And that's the cheapest you can get as far as burial. Absolutely. Wow. Least expensive. And so, yeah, I mean, I don't even have necessarily, $750 is going to be a big expense for somebody like me, unexpectedly. I'm certainly not looking to buy burial property right now. I have more important fish to fry. So, it is something to think about. What do you want to happen to your body when you die? What is the financial burden of that? What are your options? And the other thing is that you can prearrange your funeral, but that's really only a good option for people who are sort of settled where they want to be for the rest of their life.
Right.
If you bigger corporations will have options that guarantee that if you pass out of state that they will bring you home. Certainly there are funeral companies that offer those kinds of protections, but they come with a dollar sign. And also prearranging your funeral is expensive. Doing it on a payment plan requires, the cost of insurance, which is basically interest on the amount that you're paying. So if you prearrange a cremation today and you want to pay on it for 15 years, that's going from something that's $3,000 to almost $6,000 is what you'll wind up actually paying.
Wow.
If you pay just like, $50 a month or whatever for the next gazillion years. So that's not a great financial plan for younger people who are worried about, achieving other goals or paying off student loans or just like navigating life in a recession. So yeah, it is really important to have a conversation with your community. And that's not to say that your wishes can't be honored, but it is good to talk with your loved ones and talk with your community and say, hey, if I were to die, like, do we want to do a GoFundMe? Like, how many people would contribute to my funeral? Like, to at least start that conversation so that when somebody dies, even if it is not necessarily unexpected, people are ready to mobilize. They know that there's a plan. They're not sitting there like grasping at straws, like dealing with their grief while they're trying to figure out where to come up with several $1,000s. They can say, okay, like we knew that our friend was on hospice. We knew they were dying. Like we're going to start fundraising within the community to make sure their wishes are honored and give them a funeral that makes everybody feel good about their memory.
And we did a whole series on all the different options in terms of, burial, cremation, water cremation, all of those different things. So we have a whole series on that for any of the listeners who want to go and say, well, what are the options? But I've also seen as a nurse, working in hospitals where even before you get to the point of, well, where am I going to be buried and how much is that going to cost? It's like, so who makes the decision about release from the ventilator, or who makes the decision about what technology we're going to use or what we're not going to use? And if you haven't done your paperwork and if you're not married, then it falls to your next of kin. And, and at the same time, I mean, I've seen situations where families not only, and this is, this case was a young person, not only were they dealing with the fact that he was dying very suddenly, without warning, but also that, and he's gay and he has a partner. So it was like this whole big, like reveal, if you will, of all this information, and the mom was just not equipped to deal with it.
Yeah, that's really heartbreaking. Definitely.
Yeah, it was.
I mean, it's definitely, I think, more accessible to do your end of life planning and your, I guess, disaster planning in regards to things that happen before you pass. You can do advanced directives and things like that, and there's less of a financial burden, I think, to give those sort of rights to your partner or your friends and stuff. But yeah, I mean, things become extremely complicated when somebody is dying, and stuff comes out the woodwork. People come out the woodwork. It gets weird. It gets really weird.
Yes.
I mean, I definitely understand that.
You can make it a little bit easier if you do a little bit of pre-planning, which, I understand we don't like to, at any age, think about dying. I've had 90-year-olds as resistant to talking about it as 20-year-olds, so I don't see that as an age thing. But it's sort of like there are ways that this could be easier for your family. You're not going to, you're not going to be aware, but they're going to be aware, and all of those old whatever issues, rifts, whatever you want to call it, all of that comes in kind of full force. And
absolutely.
It's hard.
And I think it's important too, even if you are married, to think about, people beyond your spouse or beyond your immediate partner. I mean, I'll say I've been married for 3 years. I've been with my wife for 10. My parents have never met her, not one single time.
Oh my God.
I've met her family. We hang out with her family, and I still communicate with my own family, but they have not met her. My parents and her parents have never met each other. And so we were a little over a year ago in a fire at the funeral home that we were living at. We woke up in the middle of the night and the whole place was full of smoke. The roof was on fire.
Oh my God.
We managed to get out. We managed to get our dog out, called 911, but it was a total loss. And probably within like 15, 20 minutes of us exiting the building, the roof was in flames right above our bed. So we could have died together in that fire very easily. And I really don't know what our families would have done. I don't know what my parents would have done with that, because we don't have children. We will never have children. And so, if we are both to die together, then the rights of our disposition go to our families, unless we prepare otherwise. And yeah, I sometimes sit there and just sort of ponder to myself, like, how would they have navigated that? Like, would we have been buried separately? Would we not be together in death? I mean, I feel like I go around making my desires clear in regards to what I want to happen to my body when I die. But that doesn't mean that those wishes would be honored if my wife is also dead.
So did that inspire you to, have the rites of disposition form, adding another person on there?
Yeah, I mean, we don't have rights.
Oh my God. Go ahead.
Yeah, we didn't have primary rights of disposition for each other because we didn't need them as a married couple. But it definitely has us considered like who else could come forward in that instance. And, something that other legally married people should think about, like who's your second option. We have other couples who are like family to us. And so, I would hope that if something would happen to us, that they would step up. And certainly, I mean, I can just be honest, we haven't done that paperwork. We've been dealing with a lot of other things involving losing everything in your life to get to that. But yeah, I mean, if we would have died together, like, it would have just been weird. I think it would have been really painful for all of our friends to have to navigate that, knowing that, people who've never even met my wife, people who've never met each other are not now trying to honor, the wishes of and handle the disposition of two people dying together. So thank God that didn't happen. But definitely something to think about, even if you are married, who your second option is going to be if there are concerns about your wishes and also your gender identity. I mean, we can both say confidently that if we would have died together, that neither of us would have had our identities respected at all.
Oh, well, that would, I would think, be a highly motivating factor to get that paperwork done.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, definitely. But again, it is a financial burden on people. And so that is kind of a hard ask to your friend group to say, hey, if I die, which you've seen now that I very much could, are you willing and able to accept the financial responsibility of my death in order to honor my wishes and honor me as a person? That's a big ask. It's a tough ask. You can sit there with yourself and have those conversations with yourself and get your wishes out. But when you start to bring in other people, that's not, it's not the easiest conversation. You have to be realistic about it, and you have to sit down and have a pretty sobering conversation with people about the realities of end of life planning and end of life process.
Have somebody say, I'll be yours if you'll be mine, so that, so then it's like, well, but okay, we can do that, but don't you die first or whatever.
Yeah, then if they're yours, then who's theirs?
Well, that's what I'm saying is that, you always have to have that backup person because you don't know in what order these things are going to take place. But I think, I think that it's, I think that it's important that if I identify whatever gender I identify as, that I want that respected even if I'm not here. So, I would say to our listeners, if that's important to you, get a team of people together, you could do a co-op of people maybe who'd be willing to step in for each other. And, I think we're pretty creative people. We could figure out a way that would happen. And
yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
I think it's also important to consider or to have the conversation with your chosen family and your loved ones about what they can reasonably expect in regards to pushback. I almost feel like it's easier for people who have like full estrangement from their family. I think in our situation where we're both very much still involved with our families, whether our families are involved with us or each other, it would be difficult. If I have given my right of disposition to my best friend, my parents are going to be pissed about that. And they, might, who knows, they might hire a lawyer in that kind of situation or something. Like, can you expect the family, the legal next of kin, the legal family of the person you love that you're trying to care for to act against this. And if that happens, what are your options? Do you back down there? Do you have the money to hire a lawyer and fight this? Like, are they going to hire a lawyer and fight this? Like, it can get complicated and it can get expensive. And I think, that's something to think about too in regards to these sort of legalities.
So if you went and talked to your parents, like now that the fires happened and and say, hey, I worked on this guide and this is my concern. If I would have died in that fire, how would you have buried me? Would you have acknowledged my wife? What would you have done? Do you think they would talk to you about that?
Oh yeah, probably, but it wouldn't be a pleasant conversation.
No.
It's complicated.
Parents aren't around to make our lives easy, are they?
Yeah, it's complicated, and there's definitely some conversations that we tend to tiptoe around.
Yeah.
I am curious. I probably should ask them, but I have to be prepared to be having a bad time after that happens.
Mhm. Or think of the relief in case they say, well, here's my answer to that. Like, who knows? Sometimes parents can surprise you too,
Yeah, definitely. Oh yeah, there's definitely some conversations we should probably sit down and have eventually, but that's a whole other can of worms.
For sure. Well, Ezra, I so appreciate you taking time to chat with me. I asked if you'd talk with me for 10 minutes, and you've been very generous with your time. But it's been, I think, a fascinating conversation. And I appreciate you, and I appreciate the work that you've been doing.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me on. It was great. I love to talk about death. Happy to do it anytime.
You and me both. So thank you, and have a great day.
Thanks. You too.
Thanks.
Please stay tuned for the continuing saga of Everyone Dies, and thank you for listening. This is Charlie Navarrete. Here's a short poem by the poet W.S. Merwin titled, For the Anniversary of My Death. Every year, without knowing it, I have passed the day when the last fires will wave to me, and the silence will set out tireless traveler, like the beam of a lightless star. Then I will no longer find myself in life, as in a strange garment, surprised at the earth, and the love of one woman, and the shamelessness of men. As today, writing after 3 days of rain, hearing the wrens sing and the falling cease, and bowing, not knowing to what.
And I'm Marianne Matzo, and we'll see you next week. Remember, every day is a gift.
This podcast does not provide medical advice. All discussion on this podcast, such as treatments, dosages, outcomes, charts, patient profiles, advice, messages, and any other discussion are for informational purposes only and are not a substitute for professional medical advice or treatment. Always seek the advice of your primary care practitioner or other qualified health providers with any questions that you may have regarding your health. Never disregard professional medical advice or delay in seeking it because of something you have heard from this podcast. If you think you may have a medical emergency, call your doctor or 911 immediately. Everyone Dies does not recommend or endorse any specific tests, practitioners, products, procedures, opinions, or other information that may be mentioned in this podcast. Reliance on any information provided in this podcast by persons appearing on this podcast at the invitation of Everyone Dies or by other members is solely at your own risk.